My name's, okay. Okay, I'm Claudia Burke, and I'm a junior at Princeton, and I'm here because...
Junior at Princeton?
Yes. 1969. And someone that I knew from Princeton was involved in this and called at the Women's Center where I work. And the coordinator of the Women's Center mentioned that I'm very interested in this issue. And so I'm here. I'm in the politics department, and I'm doing my independent work sort of generally on the topic of militarism. I did my first semester junior paper on women's involvement in the peace movement during World War I. And I'm working now on a paper on the Vietnam War and just about the government distortions, how the government just didn't tell us the truth about what was going on. And I think that I'm going to do my thesis on something about militarism and how bad it is, which is more or less what I'm speaking on tonight. I'm going to talk about the environmental impact of nuclear weapons development and the economic impact of the enormous amounts of money that we spend on it. So that's what
maybe you can just give us kind of a brief summary of what you're going to talk about tonight.
Okay, well, I think first of all that our weapons program is destroying our environment. We've accumulated about 60 million cubic feet of radioactive waste from the weapons program, and that's 4 times the amount of radioactive waste that we've produced from energy-producing nuclear reactors. So we've produced an enormous amount of radioactive waste, and it's leaking. 430,000 gallons of it leaked in Hanford, which is on the Columbia River in Washington. And there was another major leak in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, which was also on a river, which is a water supply for people. So we're getting radioactive waste in the environment. The other thing is that an enormous part of the western United States is going to be torn up for uranium mining. And after they mine uranium, they leave the mill tailings just lying around, and those are also radioactive. They also want to build the EMX missile system in the West, which involves tearing up a lot of land to put the missiles on tracks and run them around so that they won't ever be in one place at the same time, so they can't be targeted. And also the West is an area where we've tested a lot of nuclear weapons, which has, again, resulted in a lot of radioactivity hanging around in the area. So that's environmentally. On the economic side, we're spending billions of dollars on defense, which can't be spent on human needs. One example is $3.42 billion will buy 2 Trident submarines, and the Navy wants 14. That same amount of money is the total federal funds appropriated for elementary and secondary school education in fiscal year 1980. Another example is that Reagan wants to spend about $185 billion on defense, quote unquote, next year, and we spend $16 billion on Medicaid, and Reagan thinks that's too much. He wants to cut that by $100 million. So we're spending enormous amounts of money that we therefore don't have to fund human needs. In addition, defense spending is highly inflationary because it puts money into the economy and it doesn't put consumer goods into the economy. And in fact, it's going to worsen our federal deficit, which people like Reagan say it's very bad for us to deficit spend, and that increases inflation. But in fact, under Reagan, our budget deficit next year will be $18 billion more than under Mr. Carter's proposals for next year because of the enormous increases in military spending. So we can't balance the budget, creates even more inflation. And lastly, defense spending produces far less jobs than any other kind of federal spending because it's so capital intensive. So it's very bad for the economy. It diverts money that we need for other things. It increases our inflation, it increases our unemployment, it increases our deficit spending, it destroys our environment, and it's just bad. We shouldn't do it.
How do we reverse these priorities?
How do we reverse these priorities? Well, I think for starters, you can just step back a little from what Mr. Reagan wants to do. I mean, Mr. Reagan makes Carter look like a moderate. Reagan wants to increase defense spending $28 billion next year over Carter's projections. So for starters, you just stop doing it. I mean, Reagan is just like, let's go in billions of dollars, so you just step back a little. And then...
Doesn't he seem to be getting a lot of support from the president on that?
From the political climate. I think it's possible that he is getting a good deal of support. I think a lot of Americans are really uninformed about what the issues are and what they mean, and I don't think that, for the most part, the major media really addresses the issues correctly. I think that what gets presented is, oh no, we're falling behind the Russians, and nobody really bothers to analyze the fact that, you know, we can already blow up the world more times than it exists, or that the fact that the Russians are spending a greater proportion of their GNP on military spending doesn't necessarily mean that they have better weapons or more weapons, or the fact that the Russians are spending more money doesn't necessarily mean that we're behind. I don't think that the real issues are being discussed by and large. So I think if Berrigan does have a lot of popular support, I tend to believe that it's slightly uninformed support.
How do you feel about the postures, the action that they took?
I think that it's commendable in that I think that the Plowshares 8 are very much to be commended in that they've followed their consciences and they've put themselves on the line in order to do what I was talking about, to bring these issues into discussion and to bring these issues into dialogue. To that extent, I think it's a very commendable action, and I only hope that it will result in these issues being discussed instead of what I'm afraid might happen, that it will just be portrayed as this group of radical screaming fanatics. I think that there are some very important issues that have to be discussed, and they're not being discussed.
Do you have any idea why they're not being discussed?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I'm very disturbed by what I see in most of the mass media. I read the New York Times every morning. I think part of it is just the instant news type syndrome. You know, we're going to give you the story in 30 seconds, and there just really isn't enough time devoted to discuss an issue as complex as military spending and what does this mean? What are we spending the money on? What's it for? So I think part of it is that the time and the space isn't devoted. As to why that is, there's a lot of interesting questions. Personally, I have my doubts that a newspaper that accepts full-page ads for Mobil Oil is going to tell you the truth about nuclear power, and I wonder where a lot of the major media gets its advertising money from. But I'm not really qualified to make indictments of who's running CBS or whatever. I just think there's enough grounds to ask some questions.
Any questions up there, Tom? Art? No. Anything you'd like to say to the American people? Or whatever.
This is your chance to make use of the normal media.
This is the opportunity to enlighten the media.
Okay, well, I would encourage the American people to study the issue of military spending much more carefully than just what's presented immediately in the mass media. I would urge them to listen to or read things by people like Daniel Ellsberg and Helen Caldicott and Robert Aldridge, and I would just encourage people to look beyond the front page and look beyond the CBS Evening News and get the facts for themselves, because the facts are there if you look for them. Thank you.